5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
You're listening to the GHT Overland Podcast. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us on the GHT Overland Podcast. This is where you get the greatest interviews and insights from overland travelers around the globe, learning from their stories and experience as we interview overlanders from places like Australia, Africa, the Americas, and Portugal.
You will learn the basics to the advanced in overlanding, so buckle up and get ready for more adventure. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lisa. This is part 2 with Dan of The Road Chose Me. As one of our listeners, Itchy Feet Overland, said last week, Dan is the real deal.
Dan is very forthcoming with such valuable experience on everything we talked about. This week, we get into finances, and Dan brings it with solid info we found very helpful, and we think you will as well. Are you ready?
Actually, because I missed the interview, yes, let's do this.
So managing currency, any tips you've got for us there as you're going from one country to another in making sure that you either, I don't know if you use like an ATM card or what tips do you have there?
Yeah, I do have an ATM card that I use mostly whenever possible, but lots of countries, that doesn't have that infrastructure or it's inconvenient.
Sure.
And so what I usually do is I try to Google the exchange rate before I'm going across the border, so I at least have an idea. And it gets really complicated too. You're in a country where they're giving you 10,000 whatevers for a US dollar, and then the other country gives you 6,421 for a US dollar. So then you have to try and figure out, okay, so what if you just go from one to the other? So it's nice to have an idea of what the exchange rate is. And then at the borders, I always thought that changing money would be really stressful and that people would try to snatch it off me or rob me and again, that kind of thing has just never happened. I've never even gotten that vibe once. And a couple of the borders, I've changed many hundreds of US dollars cash, like $500, $600, $800. And the people around, they're always really friendly. In fact, they give me the big wad of their money. And so now I'm holding both stacks of money and I count. And they're happy for that to take as long as I want it to. No problem, no rush, no stress. Once I'm satisfied, I give them the big stack of US dollars. They count their stack of money, and then there's always a handshake at the end and a thank you. So it's never been like a big stressful ordeal, although kind of I always think it will be, but it never is.
Oh, that's super interesting. And then, Dan, how did you figure out like how much to convert so that you didn't end up on the other end with too much of their currency?
Yeah, it's kind of just a guessing game, Chris. And for me, I always like to travel with at least enough cash in the local currency to buy a full tank of gas. Because I feel like if I got stuck somewhere, I could just eat plain rice, but I would need to be able to buy gas, to get to somewhere where I can get more money. And so when I cross the borders, I like to change at least that much money to be able to buy a tank of gas, maybe, stop at a street market or roadside food stall. And then once I've been in the country for a couple of days, I can get a better feel for how expensive things are and whether I'll need more money or if I go to an ATM or kind of how that's going to play out. But the other thing is too, I try not to stress about it too much because there's always someone at the border who's willing to then, if you've got too much left over from a certain country, you can always offload it when you're getting into the next country. And I guess you lose a few dollars in the conversion, but in the grand scheme of things, a few dollars is no big deal.
Okay, so not something to be overly concerned or stressed out about.
No. And it seems like a big thing, how much money should I have? But as long as you've got enough to buy gas, don't worry if you've got too much. Having too much money is an easy problem to fix.
Sure. So let's dive deeper a little bit on finances. One of the most common questions asked is, how can you afford to do what you're doing? Or I'm sure you've probably gotten the, you must have won the lottery or be rich. Obviously, the real question is, how can they do what you're doing? What are some tips our listeners can put into practice to accomplish their overland dreams that they've been thinking about like you did?
For sure, Chris. Yeah, this is the number one question I get asked. And for me, it's just a question of priorities. And so when I was working at a desk, when I was saving money to do this kind of adventure, I just had to decide on every day, how much money would I spend on kind of other stuff like cups of coffee or Netflix or, going out for dinner versus how much money am I putting into my savings account? And so I just try to be really conscious of this idea that whatever extra I'm spending money on is basically just delaying my dreams. And it's an ongoing battle, and no one's perfect. I had my bad days, I had my bad weeks, but it's a long-term game of realizing the more money I can be putting away, the sooner my dreams will come true, and maybe the bigger my dreams can be. And if I'm not putting away any money, I'm basically just admitting to myself I'm never going to get to live my dream. So for me, it's the little things that really count. Like I said, I don't buy coffee, I don't eat out, I don't buy new clothes. I've never bought a new car in my life. I don't own a TV. All of those kinds of things that, normally you could spend thousands of dollars a year on all of that stuff. And all of that money for me just went straight into my savings account.
Yeah, because those are all big ticket items.
Yeah, and they add up really fast. And another one that I always think of, when I got back from Argentina, I moved to a new town and got a job. And so I rented an apartment, and actually I had a roommate to save money. And so I was paying $700 a month rent for the whole time then I was going to work. Another friend of mine moved to town soon after, and she got her own place. And so she was paying $1,200 a month rent. And $700 to $1,200 maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot of money. But over those 4 years that I was going to work, that's more money than my entire Alaska to Argentina trip cost. So just the choice of having a roommate for those 4 years allowed me to save enough money to take 2 years off work and drive from Alaska to Argentina.
There you go. Any budgeting tips that you've come up with as you're doing your trips?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. And so actually I always ask other overlanders this when I bump into them. And what I've learned over both of my trips is that basically everyone who's doing these kinds of long-term adventures, they're spending between $1,500 and $2,500 per month for absolutely everything. So that's gas and visas and camping and food and national parks, vehicle maintenance, border crossings. And the difference there, between the $1,500 or the $2,500 a month, it's really just your personal choice on what kind of trip you want to have. If you're happy to wild camp and cook a lot of your own food, you can keep it at $1,500, probably even lower. But if you like to drink alcohol, you like to eat out, and you like to pay for campgrounds, that are going to have swimming pools and bars and restaurants, then you're going to get closer up to that $2,500 a month. And then so it really is just your choice on the kind of trip you want to have. And if you've got a limited amount of money and you want the trip to last as long as possible, you'll do everything you can to keep it lower. But a lot of people have limited time. And so they say, I've only got 6 months to complete this trip, so it doesn't really matter if I spend $2,500 a month for those 6 months.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. Do you work on the road? What kind of work do you do?
Yeah. On the first trip, I didn't do any work. I just got a nice tax return at about the halfway point.
Okay.
And then on this second trip, I made it a real goal of mine. And so I've been writing for a bunch of magazines as I'm on the road. And I've also published a couple of books as well that are helping to bring in an income. And just to be clear, they don't by any means pay for the trip. It's not like this whole thing is self-sustaining. They just slowed down the rate that my savings account disappeared. Got
it. Okay, cool. I really appreciate you going through the details on that. So thank you.
Oh, I know that it's the most common question, and I really like to be clear and to help people because it is one of the tricky things that stops people doing this. And so if I can help others get out there, I'd love to.
Awesome. That's great. So on navigation and communication, what did you use for communication? Any tips you've got there, from cell phones to SIM cards? How did you make sure that you were able to stay connected to the outside world?
Right. Yeah. So the world has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And essentially every country in the world now has 3G or 4G internet off your cell phone. And so what I did was just buy a SIM card in every country that I got to. And the cards are always about 50 cents or $1. They're essentially nothing. And then data usually is between $1 to $5 per gigabyte if you buy prepaid data. And then, your phone works exactly the same as it does here. And I had no trouble uploading YouTube videos and high-res photos. So for me, buying a SIM card in every country just made that connectivity so easy.
Got it. And did you use like a Garmin InReach or a Spot, any other devices that you used?
No, I don't have any satellite communication. Partially that's because the coverage in West Africa is really poor. It's one of the only regions on the planet that isn't really covered by those services. And also with a satellite phone, everyone always says, you should have one. The big thing to think about when you go really remote in these countries is who are you going to call if you do have a problem? Because
Sure.
the country doesn't have search and rescue. If you call your own embassy, they're just going to say, okay, great. Like, we can't help you. We don't have a vehicle to get out where you are. And if you called your family and friends back home, chances are the time zone change, it's the middle of the night for them, and they're going to say, okay, great. What do you want us to do about it? So I realized a long time ago that a satellite phone isn't very helpful in those countries. It's the people who are near you who are going to help. When I ran out of gas, I stuck up my thumb and locals helped me. Or when I rolled the Jeep, it was locals who helped me. Having a satellite phone wouldn't have helped at all.
Yeah, good point.
Although, caveat on that, here in North America, I think it makes perfect sense to have one because there is search and rescue and, there are services that will come and help you if you do get injured or you really need urgent help.
Okay, cool. So let's go through some onboard necessities real quick. We talked about it a little bit, but if we go back through those details, how much fuel can you carry? How far does that take you? And any other tips you might have on calculating those fuel needs?
Right. So my maximum capacity was about 40 gallons of gas. And on good roads, that'll get me 600 miles. On bad roads, it's probably less than 400 miles. And so for calculating how much I was going to need, I always had in the back of my mind, that the Jeep will never go as bad as 10 miles a gallon. That's, I've never even seen it that bad. And so as long as all my calculations work at 10 miles a gallon, then I know I'm safe. It was always nice to have extra. And so that was sort of my baseline.
Oh, smart. Okay, very good. And then again on water, how much water did you carry? And anything else you want to add to the filtration? Sounds like you've got a pretty nice setup.
Yeah. My water in this Jeep, I have a 13-gallon tank. And then on top of that, I have a few sort of water bottles floating around that I fill up. And then also I fill up my shower as well, which is another 5 or 6 gallons. So in total, I guess I get about 20 gallons. And if I needed to, I could pump the shower water through the filter system so then it would be drinkable. So it was always nice, again, to sort of have extra. And basically, if I know I'm going remote, I just fill up everything I've got. And on filtering it, for Latin America, it's really easy to buy filtered water from basically everywhere. So I would say you don't need to go to the complexity that I did. But certainly having more water than you need is always nice.
Yeah, that's true. And again, on solar, how much solar did you have? And any other tips you want to add there or points that would be important to our listeners on putting a good, solid electrical system together?
Right. Yeah. So I've got 2 100-watt panels from Renogy Solar, and they've been absolutely brilliant. And I think the part of my setup that has been so good is that my panels are permanently mounted on the roof. And so that means, from the minute the sun comes up before I'm even awake until the minute the sun goes down at night, basically I'm generating solar. And so that's even, if I'm stopped at a gas station or if I've gone for a hike, my system is just sitting there making solar, which I think is really important. And also I met people that had, movable panels and they had big extension leads they had to plug in. And after a month of that, all of the connectors are broken and all the cables are frayed because you're using them every single day. And as months turn into years, nothing can take that abuse. So for a long-term trip, my advice would be permanently mount your panels and permanently wire them in. You never have to think about it, and they're just charging all of the time.
Got it. And so a lot of I can't think of anybody that didn't. Most of the people that we've talked to that have the remote kind of setup, they put that together so that they can park in the shade and not have to be parked in the sun. It doesn't sound like you really came up with an issue with either coming short on electricity to keep your fridge running. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I understand, there were days where I would park in the shade and if I left the Jeep for 2 or 3 days, then it wasn't getting enough solar and I had to do something about that. But the routine I came up with actually was I would park the Jeep in the sun and then take my camp chair 10 yards away and sit in the shade to read a book. And so that worked really well for me. And certainly if I'm careful about how I angle it, I park it facing east. With my roof popped open in the morning, the full sun is hitting the panels, so I'm getting maximum charge, and the roof is creating shade for me at the back of the Jeep where my whole kitchen setup is. So for me, it was kind of about use the Jeep to make your own shade or just walk over to the nearest tree and sit under that. So for me, parking in the sun wasn't really a big deal. It was fine. It didn't matter.
Okay, that's good to know. So what refrigerator are you using? What size is it? And any tips you have for our listeners in selecting a good quality fridge?
Yeah, so I have a Dometic CFX 35. So that's a 35-litre, just single-door fridge. So it's not a split fridge freezer. And it has been absolutely brilliant. I couldn't more highly recommend it. Hundreds and hundreds of days, it was over 100 Fahrenheit inside the Jeep. And the fridge just sat there doing its thing, keeping all of my food cold. In fact, I never even thought about it the whole time. I just knew that it was working. It was that good. So for me, the Dometic has been great. I think a lot of the other major brands are just as good. And I would say think long and hard about what size you actually need. I think, the temptation is always just to get bigger and more. But if you do that, you're going to use up other space inside your vehicle for other things. And so if you have a monstrous fridge, then you can't have some other things. So think about the balance there between fridge size and all the other things you need inside your vehicle.
Yeah, good advice. Any specific recovery gear that you still use today and would definitely recommend to our listeners to make sure that they've got with them without having too much stuff?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common advice. If you're going to go remote by yourself, then have a winch. And I guess I was on the fence about that because the winch is heavy and then I had to use it in emergency situations. And then absolutely I knew it was worth it, and I'll never leave home without a winch. And on that, something that I guess I'd never really given much consideration to is think about where you're storing your winch controller and your things like your shackles and your recovery straps. I had them actually in one of the rear doors, and had the Jeep rolled over on the other side, I would not have been able to get them. And so the winch would have been useless to me. And even I thought about it later, a lot of my D-rings and things, they're only accessible via the rear tailgate. And again, because of the way the Jeep rolled, I was able to open the tailgate and gravity, kind of helped me. But if the Jeep had rolled the other way, the weight of the tailgate, I probably never would have got it open. So now I really am conscious about where I put my winch controller and where I put my recovery gear so that I can access it no matter how the Jeep, I don't plan on the Jeep rolling over again, but if it ever did happen, I must be able to get at that equipment.
Yeah, that's smart. Where do you store it now?
It's actually kind of just in the main passenger compartment in a box, but I can get to that box from any of the 5 doors. So I feel like unless the Jeep was underwater, I shouldn't have a problem getting at it.
Okay, very good. So road stories are always a favorite. What's a favorite road story of yours, or maybe a situation that you were nervous going into, and how did it turn out for you?
Oh, a favorite road story. A recurring theme all throughout Africa, which really brings a smile to my face, was just how welcoming people were. And it always kind of took me by surprise, even when it kept happening. And so a couple of specific examples. I was in Mozambique, exploring, trying to get to this really remote beach that I'd heard about and I'd been told was amazing. And of course, I tried to take a shortcut, which didn't turn out to be a shortcut. And so the afternoon's wearing on and the sun hits the horizon. And it's always a bit nerve-wracking to be driving into dusk and not yet have a safe place to sleep. And so I'm pushing on, and I finally get to this village just at dark. And you have these nervous feelings and you think, maybe I shouldn't have come here. This was stupid. Maybe I'm not safe. I don't know what's about to happen. And so very apprehensive. And as soon as I stepped out of the Jeep, a young man walked over to me. He held out his hand and he said, "You are welcome, my friend." And just the relief and the feeling of how welcome I was. And within 5 minutes, he'd sorted me out. He's like, yes, please, you can camp right here. And my hut is just here. And, this is my wife and these are my children. And so immediately I just felt so safe and so kind of welcomed into this little community, which was 200 miles from anything. And so for me, that just kept happening throughout the trip. I remember another time I was in Zimbabwe and I decided to go out for a beer in the evening in this little village. And so I walked into the local bar. And as soon as I walked in the door, it was very obviously a local bar. I was the only white person. And everyone kind of stared at me. It was the typical thing where the record kind of scratches and everyone stops. And I was like, oh crap, this is not good. And again, immediately a man walked over to me and he said, "My friend, let's have a beer." And so pretty quickly he bought me a beer and then I bought him a beer and then we were playing pool. And so just this continuous welcoming and this continuous feeling of I was part of a community made me feel so welcome and so happy. And that's a really common theme when you travel in Africa.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. So any helping others, any philanthropy that you do, or anything that you've seen along your travels that you might recommend to our listeners that maybe they could take a look into?
What I do, Chris, is I try really hard to just show and tell people the reality of what it's like on the ground. We all kind of hear stories about how dangerous Mexico is or about how horrible the border crossings are. And I think maybe there's a bit of a tendency, in order to get more likes on Instagram or to get more views on YouTube, some of us kind of hype that up a little bit and really focus on the danger and the safety and the preparation and, what's our escape plan. And I just try really hard not to focus on all of that and just to tell people, this is the honest truth of what it's like when you're on the ground in Mexico or in Congo. And so I feel like as a community of overlanders, we can all really help each other by being honest about, how epic is this or how achievable is this for the average person?
Yeah, that's good. Smart. So it's been a lot of fun. Anything that we've missed?
Oh, I feel like we've covered a lot and nothing comes to mind right now.
That's cool. So let's wrap it up with some fun facts about you, Dan. Do you play any musical instruments? You talked about that guitar on the road or around the campfire at night.
Not anymore, Chris. No, I used to have a guitar, but I never used it, so it went by the wayside. And so, no, I don't currently play anything.
So what's your favorite drink in the morning to get you going?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It's coffee for sure. In every country, I made a really big point to go and get a local coffee, and I always enjoyed it.
That must be really amazing to get and experience those different coffees from different regions. Oh. Was that kind of a treat for you?
Oh, in Sudan, the coffee was otherworldly. It has a whole lot of ginger in it. And so, when you put enough ginger in something, it actually gets hot, like hot and spicy. It was like that in a little espresso shot of coffee. And it was probably the strongest coffee I've ever had in my life. So by the time I'd had two of them in the morning, I was well and truly buzzed.
You were good to go.
Oh, it was amazing.
That's great. And what's a favorite beverage at night to wind down after a long day on the road?
Oh, there's no doubt a cold beer is a magical thing in Africa. And also, I don't know if you know this, but gin and tonic is a really popular drink in Africa because the tonic has quinine in it. And quinine is a natural mosquito repellent. And so what happens then is everybody always says, well, we have to have a gin and tonic because it'll keep the mosquitoes away, which means it keeps the malaria away. So in fact, a gin and tonic is a health drink.
Awesome.
So it was easy to convince myself to have a gin and tonic every evening because it was a healthy thing to do.
Yeah, no kidding. So on the beer, what kind of beer do you get in Africa, or what's a favorite of yours?
Yeah, again, I just tried hard to drink whatever the local beer was.
Okay.
And lots of countries, they kind of do that thing where they brew whatever it is under license. So, you can buy a Heineken that's brewed in Cameroon, but, it's more or less just a Heineken. Whereas I would prefer to buy, whatever their local one was, which normally turns out to be equivalent of kind of Bud Light or PBR or something like fairly thin and innocuous, but exceptionally tasty when it's ice cold.
Interesting. As a home brewer myself, that would be fun to go to Africa and actually brew some beer. Do they do like a local brew pub kind of thing?
Some of the countries, the more developed countries do have that. Yeah, I found actually a brewery run by an Alaskan guy in Zimbabwe. That was cool. Awesome. And then in South Africa too has tons of brew pubs, tons of microbreweries, and all kinds of delicious beer to choose from.
So what is your best advice to aspiring overlanders like us? What advice would you give our listeners that have listened to your story, possibly watched your YouTube channel, or hopefully gotten a couple of your books?
Yeah, my biggest advice to people is just to get out there and start doing what you love. And so start out with weekend trips, throw some gear in the car and go camping or go hiking or go fishing or whatever it is that you love about this lifestyle. That's what you should be out there doing. And the more you love it, the more you'll learn exactly what aspect of it is that you like the most. Maybe you just want to drive to a beautiful place and read a book under the shade of a tree, and that's fantastic. Go for it. And then, as time goes on, you can take your week of annual leave and try and sneak away for a longer trip. And the more you love it, the more passionate you'll get about it. And you can work up to the point where, you can try to negotiate with your boss. You can try to beg. You can try to come up with some sort of plan where you say, hey, boss, 5 years from now, I'm going to take 3 months off in the summer and I'm going to drive to Alaska. Alaska is right there and it is stunningly beautiful. And so I feel like it's such a good goal that people can work towards. And it's not going to cost a fortune, and you don't have to quit your job and sell all your stuff like a crazy person. But it's the kind of thing that is achievable, and you can work up to, and then have the adventure of a lifetime.
That's great. Now, Dan, I know you've got a couple of books available. Where can we go find those, and how can people learn more about you and stay connected with what you're doing? Right.
So I have published a couple of books. They're both on Amazon, and so the first one is called The Road Chose Me, Volume 1. And that's stories from the road from Alaska to Argentina. And the goal of that book is when people finish reading it, I want them to say to themselves, I could do this too, because Dan's a regular guy and Dan did it. So that means I can do it too. And then I've also just published a photography book from Africa. And so that's 75 full color pages called 999 Days Around Africa. And so both of those are on Amazon. And also, I've got a website and social media, and I'm The Road Chose Me across all of that. So Instagram and Facebook, and then there are YouTube videos from all of Africa. And then also I was blogging on my website as well, theroadchoseme.com.
Okay, great. So be sure and reach out to Dan and get connected with him in those ways. Any more information you'd like to give or useful resources that our listeners should check out?
Anyone who's not using iOverlander, the app for your smartphone, you definitely should be using it. It's fantastic. And also, if you're new to this and you really want to learn more, try and get yourselves to an event like Northwest Overland Rally or Overland Expo, one of these gatherings where people come. They're such amazing training events, and you can talk to people who are doing all kinds of trips in all kinds of vehicles. And I think it's the best way to learn and to sort of understand what's possible and what you need and what's maybe excess, and just to be part of the community is great fun.
Yeah, and we had met you at the Northwest Overland Rally, and you're absolutely right. Those are great events to go to. People can meet guys like you that are out doing these trips in person, ask those questions. They've got lots of different classes and ways to learn and get connected to the community. So one, it was great to meet you there. So thank you for taking the time there, and a lot of really good advice. So we are so appreciative of your time. We're humbled that you've given us such an amazing look into your world and experiences and knowledge. So Dan, safe travels and adventures to you, and we hope to catch up with you again sometime in the future.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a real pleasure to be on the show, and I hope it was useful to the listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Now I know why you were so happy with your interview with Dan. Direct, to the point, and nothing held back. Just like you.
Well, you can imagine how many others Dan has talked with over the years. Was somewhere like around 100,000 miles traveled, and he's narrowed down a budget expectation from $1,500 on the conservative side to $2,500 a month on the higher end for absolutely everything. Now, to be fair, yes, if you're a super saver, you're going to spend less.
Well, yeah, someone like us starting out, and then our listeners who might be hesitant, it's tangible. It's like you have a lower and a higher, and go for it. Like you can try and beat it or stay within it.
Yeah, and that's from years of experience with gosh knows how many other overlanders he's talked to kind of come up with those numbers. So I feel that those are really good expectations to hit the road, whether you're doing a trip through the Americas or whether you're doing a trip through Africa.
Well, and your gas might be a little higher based on the type of vehicle you have.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then I will make a note that our gin bill might be a little higher because if it's a repellent for mosquitoes, I'm going to bathe in it.
Oh, that's right. There was something in the tonic water, not the gin itself. There's something in the tonic water. I forget what that was. I
don't know, but it sounds fabulous.
If it repels mosquitoes, GNTs it is.
Absolutely.
It's awesome.
I learned to love them.
On the topic of solar, I found this super interesting with Dan's take on permanently mounting the panels, where a lot of our past guests have, well, not a lot, but a few, have mentioned that they intentionally don't mount them permanently so that they can park their vehicle in the shade and then move the panels into the sun. Now, his theory, I thought was pretty on track. And it sounds like he's got the system or his system pretty dialed in. So there's two different ways that you can do it, and you decide what works best for you.
Well, he's driving it, so it's creating electricity. So he's hooked up to it like 24/7. So I think I'm with Dan on this one. So park it. Have no time of hooking or moving anything up. And you grab your chair and your cold brew for the evening and just go sit in your chair and read a book.
I thought we decided on GNTs.
Or that. And that.
And then the other thing that really stuck out to me here was Dan's stories on the friendliness of people in Africa. His road story with the man that invited him to camp on his property and next to his hut and introduced him to his children and his wife. And then what was the other one? He went into a bar and he's the only white guy that walks in, and somebody just walks over and invites him, hey, let's have a beer. And just the friendliness and helping you feel welcome, I thought was super impressive.
Yeah. The feeling of like you're just part of the family.
Yeah, super. That is just so great. So Dan, thank you so much for your time, your insights, all of your stories, and your experience. That was an absolutely wonderful conversation. And again, Lisa, I'm sorry that you missed out on that one. That was great.
I'm sorry too. Sorry, Dan. We'll catch up with the gin and tonic.
Now, as a reminder, we had to move all show notes, or I guess better said, all show notes from here going into the future, to Patreon after hitting our maximum pages with our current web hosting company. Everything is free, so no worries there. You still go to ghteoverland.com/podcasts and just select the episode that you'd like the notes and links for, including the direct download links for each episode. And a big thank you to our Patreon supporters. Your support of the podcast seriously means the world to us. If you'd like to help support the show and get a t-shirt, coffee mug that doubles as a GNT mug at night. Take a look at the options while you're there looking at the show notes.
So again, it's a good idea to visit the show notes page on our website at ghteoverland.com/podcasts. Select the Road Chose Me episode. All the details and helpful links are already there for you.
And you can send your questions, suggestions, and feedback to ghteoverlandpodcast@gmail.com. If you have an Amazon Echo, remember to tell Alexa, play the GHT Overland podcast. Feel free to connect with us on social media at GHT Overland, and kindly share this episode with your friends who enjoy travel off the beaten path. Overland travel is all about meeting new friends, seeing the most amazing places on earth, and of course, new food and new drinks.
Lastly, if you enjoyed the episode, it would mean the world to us if you did two things to help out. Rate and review the podcast on your podcast platform of choice, and subscribe, giving the GHT Overland podcast a little extra love on your podcast platform of choice. Thank you, and we will see you next Thursday for a brand new episode of the GHT Overland podcast. Bye.